Welcome to another edition of When Technology Fails. Today I want to spend some time talking about how technologies interact with systems, in particular the educational system. I call this short talk the disconnect, because this is about a disconnect that has emerged between our educational systems and the technologies that are predominant in the world today, or increasingly predominant in the world today. The This is not a new phenomenon. We have been seeing this emerging over the last almost 50 years now, as new technologies have come on to the playing field and education has not really adapted to them. However, the good news is that we can actually change this through a use of those very same technologies that are threatening the system, in much the same way that educational systems started up in the first place. So before the 1850s, education was very artisanal. It was very much like the famous painting by Raphael, the School of Athens. There's maybe not everybody dressed up in robes, but you get the idea that everybody was, it was basically conversation. It was very much you were working with a mentor or set of mentors. There was very little need to communicate achievement when your mentor said you were ready to move on, or sent you to another mentor who knew something that he didn't know, or something like that. Then you moved on. The amount of work you did, you worked directly for that. There was no need to scale that and to make that uh, uh, mass based, because very few people went through this process. Now, the problem is that over time, we've gradually lost that connection between teacher and student. I mean, it's still there at the fundamental roots of education, but there are so much other logistical, industrial things that have come about, and that's kind of what the process is that I want to talk about today. And ultimately, how do we reconnect those two things? So, going back in time to the early part of the 19th century, we have the invention of the blackboard. Now, this was a seems like a pretty mundane thing these days, but what that did is it allowed us to create rooms of larger numbers of people to learn together. And this is a good thing because at the same time we had the Industrial Revolution going around, which required a larger percentage of the population, still a pretty small percentage overall, to gain upper education, and it also required the masses to get what we call public education these days, where basically the three R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and the and this made all that possible. The blackboard. It's you've got a big board in front, somebody can write on it, and everybody can follow along. But the problem that occurred is now you have one teacher with a much larger group of students, maybe 20, 30, maybe 100. And you have a problem where you need to somehow figure out how to assess that. You cannot do this individually assessing anymore. You have to uh, uh, create a assessment tools like tests and essays and things like that. And then that in turn requires a certain amount of logistical automation with grades and other things, where you're now having to communicate that achievement to other classes or within the institution. For the most part, this stuck within the institution. It was fairly informal to begin with, but it became much more formal as time went on. Initially it was good enough to say that Yale gave me a degree, and it didn't really matter what your grades were at that point. If you got to the point where you were blessed by the institution, that was good enough. But over time, in the early 20th century, the Carnegie system came into play, and in order to get the Carnegie funding, institutions were required to standardize around sets of grades. But we're still talking about a fairly elite educational system where pretty small percentage of the population particularly went through higher education. But you still needed those doctors and engineers and lawyers and people like that in order to run a much more complex society. But then another systemic shock happened with World War II. And World War II was very much a technological war. And suddenly you needed a lot more people who could do fairly advanced tasks. And this was a real struggle for most economies during the war, particularly though in the West, where we went to a very scientific method of pursuing warfare. With everything from computational ballistic trajectories and cannons and things like that, all the way up to the atomic bomb. And so this led to pressure after the war, especially when the World War II led into the Cold War, for an even greater scaling of education. We needed more people to go to college because the Cold War was even more of a scientific war. And fortunately, again, for education, technologies came along or existed to a certain extent, but really gained wide acceptance that allowed us to scale into something, which I will call mass higher education. And now all of a sudden, those 100-person classrooms become 500-person classrooms. And you have a much more standardized system, a much more depersonalized system. Projectors allow us to have much larger rooms than blackboards are. You're not limited to the size of handwriting anymore. You have systematized mass assessment. The Scantron makes an appearance starting in the mid-20th century. And then increasingly over the next 20 years, the 50s and 60s, you have the incorporation of mainframe computers at most institutions, which allow the storing of student data, but a very simplified form of student data. And this is where you start to see the 4.0 grading system that we're all familiar with, which is an extrapolation of the ABCD. But the problem is that in this system, the individual becomes more and more lost, more and more separated from the teacher, more and more separated from the process. And the process starts becoming more important than the learning over time. Starting in the 1970s, you already started to have critics like Ivan Illich who would speak up and say, we're doing the system here. We're not doing learning. And over time, this became clearer and clearer, especially to students. But what took over was this credentialing of employees, to where employers required increasingly college degrees in order to do jobs. Now, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not those jobs really need quote unquote college degrees. And then again, what does that mean? The employers found that people who went to college, generally speaking, were more effective employees, but they couldn't really tell why they were more effective employees. And in many cases, they found that they had to do extensive retraining, especially in specialized fields like architecture, engineering, and whatnot. At the same time all of this was going on, we have the emergence of what I'll call mass knowledge systems. The mass adoption of knowledge technologies like the personal computer starting in the 1980s. Eventually that led to the internet, or the massification of the internet. I know the internet starts in the 1960s, but the World Wide Web, and when everybody suddenly became aware of and started using the internet in the 1990s as a way of connecting people up. Web 2.0, which provided a wide range of creation tools. Among other things, they allowed people to create artifacts that cheat the system, like sharing essays or test banks and things like that, and sharing things in ways that were difficult under the original internet, where you had to know a certain amount about creating websites and other things. The tools were much more limited in the 90s than they were in the 2000s and going forward. And then today, AI is just the latest technology in this. Again, something that goes back, but in the 2020s, it suddenly hits this mass population awareness and accessibility that wasn't the case. We had AI going back to the 50s and 60s, but it was, in the 90s, you have things like Deep Blue beating the chess Garry Kasparov. But now we start seeing the widespread use of publicly accessible AI. In the 2010s already, we had AIs in the form of, or what we would now call AIs, in the form of algorithms and things like that. But those were largely controlled by the companies that ran them, and they required specialists to run, and most people just didn't have access to that except as customers. Now, what was education's response to this? Well, they said, if we put together the personal computer and the internet, hey, we can scale the lecture hall. And that's really what has happened with online education. And suddenly, instead of a class, and the ultimate expression of this is the MOOC, the massive online courses from the 2010s, which are great as far as disseminating information, but they're horrible as far as personalizing learning. And for some people, you don't really need that, if they're just sort of there as consumers of information. But most students want to be taught at some level, and this makes that impossible. And most online courses make it very difficult. And making classes bigger because, hey, you don't have to sit in a classroom and project over 100 or 500 seats. You can do that online, and everybody can hear you just fine because you've got a microphone. So that became, these things formed more and more disconnect. And you see more and more students gaming the system through cheating. And you have this weaponization of anti-cheating technologies on the education side. But this is all just sort of building up a dam against a rising flood of information. And it ignores a basic idea that, education no longer has a monopoly on information. And it no longer has a monopoly on what to do with that information, in the sense. It doesn't mean that the rest of the world does it better or anything like that, but I would argue that there are a lot of things about the way that information works that you learn in education, in an educational environment, to make that makes that all better. And makes it better. It makes you a better user of information. But that's hard to put your finger on, right? And so this creates what I will call the disconnect. The reality is our educational systems are still basically on grades. They're still based on those technologies. You can trace the lineage back all the way to the blackboard and assessment and the very early forms of grades, and then scaling that. So it's just been a question of scaling at that point. And the ultimate outcome of that is credentialing. But it's credentialing with questionable meaning. You have both students saying, what is the purpose of all of this stuff I'm learning? I don't see how this is going to impact my ability to work. Teachers and institutions don't necessarily understand that really well either. And employers are increasingly dissatisfied with the product that comes out of that system. And students aren't really feeling like they're getting anything out of it in terms of that deeper growth in their mindset. There are obviously exceptions to this. But this is what's starting to emerge in the cracks, because basically what happens is that people become fixated on grades and everything that surrounds those grades, and the learning becomes secondary to that. And then most of their learning happens outside of that framework. That was true in many ways for myself growing up in the 70s and 80s. I learned outside of school because at that point already, there wasn't a lot of meaning in what I was doing in school. And so I found it elsewhere. Now, of course, I was lucky to be self-motivated in that and had access to wonderful libraries because of my father being a university professor. But that's where I did my education, is hanging out in university libraries as a teenager. But at the same time, parallel to that development on my part, this group of technologies, starting with a personal computer and leading all the way up to AI, these are the foundations of society today. When I say personal computer, I mean that in a very broad sense, because I would include mobile devices as just being an extension of those personal computers, and then combining that with the powers of the internet and Web 2.0, and then ultimately AI as well. These things all fit together in a technological mesh in many ways, like the older technologies did. But this is the green circle here is what's really churning the digital economy, and the red circle is what is still driving our educational systems. And there's a real impact to this. Over the last 10 years, higher in the areas where students have a choice, i.e. after you get out of high school, we're starting to see a decline in enrollment. And, Brian Alexander, a good friend of mine, has been tracking this for years. And since 2013, we've lost about 4.5 million students out of the system. And a recent poll in the Wall Street Journal Is 4-year college 60%? Is 4-year college worth it? 60% said it wasn't worth it, and it was particularly strong in the exact demographics that normally go to college. So there's a lot of factors that come into play here, but demographics are one part of it. There are fewer kids, and colleges and universities need to expand their client base quite a bit in order to maintain current levels of enrollment. But and then of course they don't. But do they have a product that appeals to older students, to lifelong learners? And they need that help. The world is shifting and shifting and shifting. People need to be lifelong learners. We keep saying this over and over again, yet we don't provide a real mechanism for people to learn once they've left the traditional bounds of a 4-year college or maybe a graduate degree or something like that. But it's a box. You have to go into that box to learn, and then when you're out of that box, you're not learning anymore, right? Well, that's not true either. So this is evidence that there is pressure on this system, though. We're seeing more and more people opting out and saying, you know what, it's not worth the money, it's not worth my time. It's been a struggle even for those people who are inside, because they're just gaming it to get the degree. And when they graduate, there's a lot of data. If you go back and look at Academically Adrift, a book from 10 years ago, there's data that shows that the amount of personal growth, the ability of people to do deep thinking and critical thinking doesn't really expand all that much over the course of a 4-year undergraduate degree. That's disturbing. That is a difficult truth to face, and that doesn't mean that universities don't have a role. They absolutely have a role. Colleges, universities, higher education has an absolutely critical role in society. But because of this disconnect, because of this feeling of what's the point, right? You start seeing quotes like the one here from Elon Musk. College is basically for fun and prove that you can do your chores. It's not about learning. And so what's happening is you're starting to see these deconstructed learning experiences. People are going outside the system. You have companies that are producing their own learning pathways. Google's, Microsoft all have their internal quote unquote universities, colleges, whatever they call them, where they learn what the company feels like they need them to learn, because they're not getting the product that they need from the institutions outside of their control. And then lots of private things, lots of little certificates and micro credentialing and badging. Again, by in and of themselves, they're not necessarily a bad thing, but they're a symptom of a broken system. Why is this a problem? People lose that context, and I think one of the strongest things about the college experience, if it's done right, is you get that contextual connection between lots of different branches of learning. I'm a very big proponent of liberal arts learning and the liberal arts approach to things that will expose you to lots of different ways of thinking about problems. Those are what make you a successful employee. That's that it factor, that hard to put your finger on it factor that college gives you. It's not about job training. It is about job training. It isn't about job training at the same time. It's about training you to be a better. The one example that I tell my students all the time, I have a liberal arts education. I've never taken a computer class in my life. And yet when I got out of grad school, for various reasons, I ended up supporting computers for Apple and for Motorola. And I was good at it. Why was I good at it? Well, because my liberal arts training taught me how to do problem solving, how to break down issues. And when it comes to a computer, it's just a question of breaking down the problem. In many ways, that works much better than trying to find an answer in some manual somewhere over time. And it also allows you to confront the unexpected, which isn't in the manual. And that's what a truly good employee does, is that they're capable of dealing with the unexpected when the company has to shift, or when the environment that the company operates in shifts. But this is a potential, I'll call it a dystopian future for education, where you still have shrunken higher education world with uh, elite universities primarily who are selling the network that they offer to students. Smaller colleges may survive if they can figure out a way to do this in a cost-effective manner. But larger universities, community colleges, things like that are going to be threatened in this kind of environment because they're going to be easier. They may not be cheaper, although they may be cheaper, but more importantly, they're much more accessible. You don't have to sign up for a course. You don't have to jump through all the hoops that you have to jump through to work on a degree or even a certificate. You just sign up for it. The next day you're taking class, and the technology exists to do that today. And AI would be one way of organizing all of this. So the problem is not the people. People are part of a system. Every faculty member I know wants desperately to help the students. Administrators want to help their students. But they're caught up in a system that doesn't necessarily serve the needs of those students. But at the same time, I see all the time from the very same people who are trying really hard to make the world a better place, frustration because they're like, shrug their shoulders. What am I going to do? I can't get away from grades, for one thing. They're part of the system. We can't just get rid of grades. A lot of other things would break as a consequence. The students would rebel. Those are all nice, but they're a little utopian in my mind in terms of changing the system. So about 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago now, Donella Meadows, who is a systems thinker who learned from Jay Forrester back in the 1960s, but subsequently spent the next 30 years of her life, unfortunately cut short a few years later, fighting for environmental change, for realistic environmental strategies to save the planet. And she kept running up against these systems and could not figure out how to get around them. And so eventually in the mid-1990s, she developed this leverage point model to try to understand where she was running up against problems. And the basic idea here is that the higher up on the line here, from 12 being the lowest and 1 being the highest, a little counterintuitive, the more resistance you encounter. But the problem is at the low end of the lever, it's easier to do things, but they don't really make that much of a difference to the overall system. And this is what we're running into. So at the low end of the level, you have assessment and grades, and those are largely the province of faculty. We can make changes on those fairly easily, what grades mean, change assessment types and things like that. But are they going to really change the overall thing when we're stuck with this 4.0 system of grades that, if you're going to, and we have to be able to information exchange and transfer from one program to a next within larger institutions, from one institution to the next, or from institutions to potential employers. That underlies everything that we do. Enrollment, certification, transcripts, well, that falls into the administration side of things. And their concerns are built around this system of making sure that the flow of product, and students are product, they're not customers, making sure that flow of product moves through the system, that they have all the right stamps on them when they come out the other end, that they do come out at the other end. Then there's rethinking the larger structures, and that falls to accrediting agencies on a very physical level. That's the social system, social structure. It falls to accountability mechanisms, maybe state legislatures or state education boards or higher education boards. That are their responsibility is maintaining the efficiency and accountability of the systems of grading, and they go all the way back down to faculty. And then there's the mental models that people have of education. You can't just sort of snap your finger and change people's thinking about Why am I going to school? I try this all the time with my own students. I cannot get them to decouple from the idea that the ultimate purpose of my class isn't to learn anything, it's to get the grade at the end of the process. If they can do that, it's good enough. Move along. It's just stamp my ticket and move me on down the line. And that also shapes the way outsiders think of our institutions. It makes us vulnerable to criticism because people don't really understand how you get from a grade on a test that doesn't seem to have any real meaning to I can suddenly be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. Well, the reality is in those disciplines that require a lot of practical knowledge, we don't graduate somebody from medical school, hand them a scalpel, and push them into surgery. No, that's why you have to do residency, and that's where they do the real hard learning, is in that practical application of what they're doing. Same thing in engineer. You don't have a fresh out graduate engineer who's done all these formulas and theories in class, and then suddenly give them oversight in creating a dam that's going to hold back 1 billion gallons of water or something like that. You just don't do that. Oh, those systems have built-in safety valves to make sure that the people who ultimately get the responsibility have learned on the job through, guess what, that old mentorship program. You get paired up with senior doctors, engineers, architects, whatever, and that's how you learn how to do the job. Technically, you don't need school for that. I've worked for an architecture firm, and I've worked with engineers, and I hear the same refrain over and over again. People come out of college, we can't give them any real responsibility without them being on the job for 5 years before they really learn how to do architecture or engineering or whatever. We don't want to have to spend that. It's expensive. But you still need that rubber stamp that says, "Hey, I've got a college degree," in order to be able to do that. But think about think about what's really going on there, as opposed to, what the system is supposed to be doing. So these things all support the system. It goes all the way back to assessment and grading. With assessment and grading, that's again under the faculty purview. That builds into courses, credit hours, programs, semesters. That's the administration side. That falls into this information area in the middle here, the yellow area. Then in the interinstitutional environment, you have accreditation, transcripts, disciplines. They maintain the standards from institution to institution that allow students to transfer from one institution to another or to matriculate from one institution to another. And then at the top level, you have society, which has to ask real deep questions, especially if public funds are being used. How do you define success in education? What is the purpose of education? And this goes all the way down to K-12. All of this stuff supports itself and creates a system of education whose focus is on the production of grades, not learners. How do we get around this? Well, at a very basic level, I think we need to look real seriously at tangible work products. I use tangible work products in my own classes, and they are a very powerful way of creating something beyond the class. So my students create a website that shows their ability to communicate complex issues. And it's their website. It's not in the class. It's outside the class. It's on a public web server. And they keep that. And I tell them over and over again, not I'm sure they always believe me, that at the end of the day, an employer is going to look at that and use that as a way. It's a much better way for an employer to say, hey, this person knows how to do something useful, as opposed to, I got a B in a government class. Faculty could implement this on a class-by-class basis. They can do it themselves. I do it myself. The challenges there, of course, is that the culture of the students coming into that environment, if they're not used to it from the other classes, it's much harder. It would be more effective if every faculty member did it, but I can't make anybody else do it. but there's nothing stopping from anybody else from doing it either. So that influences how we do assessment. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of grades either. You do them in parallel. And so this is a product that you can put in place in parallel that will change the conversation in a class and hopefully deprecate the thinking about grades in your students' minds. That's not going to happen overnight, but over time, there's hope. At the institutional level, institutions can encourage faculty members to do this, create institution-wide programs that facilitate the creation of these work products in every class. They're going to look different. Not everybody's going to do a website. Some other classes can do different things. There's a lot of different ways to create these products. But it also opens doors to rethinking all of the other things that are built on top of grades, like course structures. It could be used to, multiple courses could get together and do interdisciplinary projects. Programs can work together to create programmatic, tangible work products. Work can extend over semesters. You're not cut off at the end of however long you've allotted, 16 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever. This creates a lot of opportunities to be creative about how we teach and learn in the system. So that's something institutions can do. At the governance level, now we start having to build things. Now, I discussed this in some detail a number of years ago in an article I did for Current Issues in Education called Thinking Backward. And it discussed the building of a giant database that would store these tangible work products and perhaps using AI provide ways of searching through them. This is something accreditation agencies could get together and do. It's something governments could get together and do. It's something international organizations could get together and do. Ideally, it would be an international organization like, say, maybe UNESCO or something like that would create this database. And then everybody would have access to it. The students could then put their work in there and then use that as a true mark of their achievement and what they can do. So when the employers need to search for groups of students who can do X, Y, and Z, they can look for actual products that have been created by those students and use that as a way of evaluating potential employees. And oh, by the way, if you open this up beyond traditional institutions, it becomes a recruiting tool because you can find students where you didn't realize they were. Because they will, if you give people the ability to create their own accounts and upload their own tangible work products into the system, it creates discoverability for them. That the institutions can go, hey, this guy in Latin America is a great, does all these amazing things with computers, and nobody knows about him because he hasn't gone through a formal schooling system. He doesn't have a transcript. I remember a number of years ago reading an article about groups in Nigeria taking e-waste from computers, from Dell and other companies, and building 3D printers out of them. That's amazing. But how do you put that in such a way that a university in the United States could find these people and say, we need to bring these people here and give them an environment where they can grow and thrive, and then they will become star students for us and star employees down the road for other people. And this would be good for our institution. So there's real opportunity to do some creative things here, but this is going to take some building. But again, the other two levels, faculty and administration, are not dependent on this. It would be better with it, but it doesn't have to happen. And technically speaking, this really isn't that hard to do, given today's technology capabilities, affordances. Last but not least, the societal level. One of the problems with success metrics is that they're based, again, on grades, which nobody really understands, and everybody suspects is somehow rigged in some way. And the reality is it's incredibly difficult to impose a level of conformity there. And you get a lot of situations like my daughter transferred from a community college and is taking courses at a senior institution. They're taking the credit because they have to, but they're not accepting any of her grades. They're basically not factoring that into her grade point average. Why? Because they don't trust the grading at the community college level. That's poor signaling. But yet, you could then create, again, with tangible work products, you could mitigate that kind of problem because you can see what people really do. And then you say, oh, yeah, this does meet our standards. We're going to give this person, full credit and highest honors or whatever based on this sort of thing. I mean, there's things that are going to need to be iterated and worked out as we go through this. And then the other thing is when people look at colleges and say, what are you there for? Are you just indoctrinating people into ideologies? Are you, a bunch of hippie professors and all this other stuff that's going around today? You can then point to these work products and say, no, this is what we build. This is real. This is tangible. You can see what our students are building. And this is how they influence the success of our societies. That's a lot more tangible than grades and transcripts and degrees. So that provides a level of signaling to the outside world that is much more understandable than our current system. So in this interesting way, tangible work products impact all of the levels of the system. Now, the system is not going to change overnight. The system this is going to take time. The bottom level can happen relatively quickly. It's easily flexible. The administration level, people just need to make some decisions. Institutions need to be leaders in this, and they'll look good as a consequence. On the governance level, that's going to take longer. Although governance could be used to drive institutions if the decisions are made. I mean, the one advantage of governance is that it's fairly centralized. You have one board or one accreditation agency that is making decisions for a large number of institutions, and that they can be used to drive the process. If the accreditation groups suddenly say, we're going to evaluate your status within the group by looking at tangible work products, that needs to be part of your reaccreditation process, institutions are going to start taking notice of that sort of thing. Society is going to take the longest because people have been trained under the current system, and that's what their expectations are based around. But when students start coming out of institutions and being much more proud about what they built than the fact that they got X grade in a class, over time, grades will fade into a secondary consideration. And then at some point, perhaps in the distant future, when I'm saying 20, 30, 40 years out, just get rid of them and nobody will notice. So what kind of world does this create? So this is all easier because we live in a digital world. We have these tools. We can use personal computing devices to create artifacts. We can use the internet to share them. We can use Web 2.0 to create and share. We can use AI to build on top of and build even more complex outcomes and criteria. We don't have to be afraid about people gaming the system anymore because, I mean, there's always going to be, any system can be gamed, but there's a real incentive to be meaningful and authentic on the part of the students. And academic dishonesty, which is a term I do not like, will decline considerably. I'm convinced of that. We can create artisanal, individualized scale processes. If we can reach more students in a much more intimate manner if we use technology to make efficiencies in the system. It doesn't cost much for me to run a Zoom classroom. It's just my time. I don't have to keep. I mean, I have to keep my own air conditioning on and things like that. But I can talk to students in a way now, teaching remotely, that I couldn't in a physical environment, or was difficult. It's much more difficult to do in a physical environment, especially with larger classes. That's another thing institutions have to think about: is can we use these processes to reach people much more directly? And tangible work products would help with that because they would also show the rationale for doing that. So we could get back to a much more artisanal learning environment. We'll have to figure this stuff out. There's a lot of questions still in this. This is not a silver bullet. It may be a silver buckshot. But that means that there's a lot of things that are going to need to be figured out as we go along and adjust the system. But from a technical slash institutional framework perspective, tangible work products can actually could actually cut through a lot of this stuff. I love Steve Jobs' quote about, the computer being a bicycle for the mind. All of these knowledge technologies are bicycles for the mind. That's what they're built for, and AI is just the latest iteration of that. So this project has kind of come out of the work I've done over the last decade. It requires a lot of flexible thinking about our digital tools and how we use them, and our systems of communicating using old tools as opposed to creating opportunities to create with new tools. There are lots of projects that are doing bits and pieces of this, but what I'm hoping will come out of this conversation that I'm trying to get started here is that people will start reframing those and connecting them up in ways that maybe hasn't been considered before. I've used tangible work products in my own classes. I see the impact that they can have. I also see that there's a lot of potential for more impact where I'm not having to fight the system, where the system is actually encouraging the creation of tangible work products across the board, and then my students develop expectations around that. Not going to happen overnight, but one of the nice things about college students is that at least at the beginning, they're fairly flexible in the sense that they come into college and they don't know what to expect. Well, we can show them something new as opposed to something old. This is going to require some paradigm shifting over time. It affects the very sinews of our institutions, but it's possible, and it could create some amazing rethinking about the purposes of education, higher education, and K-12, and how we interact with it over time. And it's only through this symbiosis of humans and technology that we're going to really reap the benefits of these new technologies across the board and get people to where we can create better things and solve complex problems, from automation to climate change to health and well-being. And these are things that require very complex solutions, or poverty. We're going to need to make those changes. This might be a path forward for that. So my contact information is here. You can contact me through this channel or whatever website you may be seeing this on. And I'm always happy to continue the conversation. And thanks for listening today.